What if the fall of Saigon wasn't a sudden collapse, but a carefully unfolding ending? On April 30th, 1975, the world watched helicopters lift off from rooftops, evacuating the last Americans from Saigon. But behind those iconic images lies a deeper question. Did South Vietnam fall in a single day? Or had the war already ended long before the last helicopter left? Tonight, we uncover what really happened. When most Americans think about the fall of Saigon, a single image comes to mind. Helicopters lifting off rooftops, crowds reaching upward, a sense of panic frozen in time. The story we've been told for decades is simple and dramatic. South Vietnam collapsed in chaos. Saigon was overrun. An ally was abandoned overnight. But history is rarely that clean, and it's almost never that sudden. Because when you slow the story down, when you look past the headlines and iconic footage, something doesn't quite add up. If this was truly a final, desperate collapse, why did resistance fall apart so fast? Why wasn't Saigon turned into a battlefield the way other cities had been earlier in the war? Where were the street-by-street fights, the last stands, the brutal urban combat that usually marks the end of a war? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why did some South Vietnamese commanders appear to stop fighting before the city ever fell? These aren't conspiracy theories. They're historical questions, asked quietly for years, often overshadowed by the emotion of the moment. Because the truth is, Saigon didn't fall the way people expected it to. And that forces us to ask a harder question. Was April 30th, 1975 really the day South Vietnam lost the war? Or was it simply the day the world finally saw the ending that had already been set in motion? Behind the scenes, far from the cameras and the rooftops, decisions were being made, decisions that would shape the final outcome long before the last helicopter took off. This wasn't just about soldiers on the ground. It was about supply lines that quietly ran dry. About promises that slowly stopped being kept. About political calculations made thousands of miles away, in rooms where the sounds of war never reached. Imagine being a commander in those final weeks. You're told to defend a city, but your ammunition is limited. Air support is gone. Reinforcements aren't coming. And you know, deep down, that the allies you relied on for years have already decided the war is over. What do you do in that moment? Do you fight to the last man? Or do you try to prevent a massacre you know you can't stop? That is the moral weight hanging over the final days of Saigon, and it's a weight most simplified histories never address. In this video, we're going to pull back the curtain. We'll look at what actually unfolded behind closed doors in the months leading up to April 30th. We'll explore why that date, so powerful in memory, was not the true turning point of the war. And we'll examine how the fall of Saigon was shaped not by a single battle, but by a long chain of decisions, compromises, and withdrawals that began well before the final moment. Because the end of a war isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through silence, hesitation, and the realization that the outcome has already been decided. And once you see the fall of Saigon through that lens, the story changes forever. April 30th, 1975. As the sun rises over Saigon, the city doesn't wake up to gunfire. It wakes up to panic. Not the kind of panic that comes from tanks rolling through the streets or bombs falling from the sky, but a quieter, more unsettling fear, the kind that spreads through whispers, radio broadcasts, and hurried decisions made before most people have even had their morning coffee. North Vietnamese forces are closing in. American evacuation is already underway. And above the city, helicopters begin to appear, one after another, circling, landing, lifting off again. Rooftops fill with people. Embassy grounds overflow. Men, women, families clutch documents, bags, sometimes nothing at all. In less than 24 hours, more than 7,000 people will be airlifted out of Saigon in what becomes known as Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history. These images burn themselves into the world's memory. For Americans watching on television, it feels like a dramatic, chaotic ending to a long and painful war. Helicopters rising into the sky seem to say one thing very clearly: this is the final moment. But history often hides its biggest secrets in plain sight. Because when you look closely at these scenes, when you stop focusing on the helicopters and start asking deeper questions, something feels strangely missing. Where is the battle? There are no massive firefights inside the city. No final, desperate defense of Saigon's streets. No drawn-out urban warfare like Hue in 1968 or earlier clashes across South Vietnam. For a war that had consumed millions of lives over 2 decades, its final act is, surprisingly quiet. And that silence matters. Because wars don't usually end like this. They don't fade out with paperwork, evacuation lists, and calm orders to stand down. So ask yourself this. If Saigon was truly being overrun, why wasn't it destroyed in the process? The answer lies in the contrast between what the cameras captured and what they didn't. The cameras showed Americans leaving. They showed panic on rooftops. They showed an ending. But they didn't show South Vietnamese units launching a final defense. They didn't show commanders calling for reinforcements. They didn't show the city turning into a battlefield. Instead, many soldiers were waiting, watching, or simply going home. For civilians, the fear wasn't about explosions, it was about uncertainty. What would happen next? Who would be in charge tomorrow? Would the city be spared, or punished? And for American officials, this wasn't about victory or defeat anymore. It was about time. Time to get people out. Time to close an embassy. Time to end a chapter that had already exhausted the nation. Operation Frequent Wind wasn't planned as a last stand. It was planned as an exit. And that changes everything. Because if the defining image of the war's end is an evacuation, not a battle, then maybe April 30th wasn't the moment the war was lost. Maybe it was the moment everyone finally accepted that it already was. The helicopters didn't rise because Saigon was falling that morning. They rose because the decision to leave had been made long before. And once you realize that, the question shifts. Not how did Saigon fall, but when did the war truly end? And why did it end without the final battle the world expected? That mystery is just beginning. If you step back and look at Saigon in the final days of April 1975, the most striking thing isn't what happened. It's what didn't happen. This was a city that didn't fight. There were no prolonged street battles tearing neighborhoods apart.
They are getting closer.
No final, dramatic urban warfare where buildings changed hands block by block. No last stand broadcast to the world as proof that South Vietnam would fight to the end. And that absence is not accidental. For years, South Vietnamese troops had fought fiercely. They had defended cities, held territory under relentless pressure, and endured losses that rarely made American headlines. These were not soldiers unfamiliar with combat. They knew how to fight, and they had done so many times before. So why, when Saigon itself was threatened, did so many units stand down? The answer isn't cowardice. It isn't betrayal. And it certainly isn't a lack of will. It's exhaustion, combined with reality. By late April, the South Vietnamese military was running on empty. Ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted. Some units were rationing bullets, counting rounds instead of firing freely. Artillery shells that once arrived by the thousands were now measured in dozens, if they arrived at all. US air support, which had once changed the course of battles overnight, was gone, not reduced, not delayed, gone. Pilots weren't coming, bombers weren't overhead, and everyone on the ground knew it. Perhaps most devastating of all, promised reinforcements never arrived. Orders came without resources, plans were drawn without supplies, and commanders were expected to hold positions they knew were no longer defensible. Imagine being asked to fight a battle you already know you can't win. Not because you lack courage, but because the tools you need have quietly disappeared. This is where wars truly end, not with explosions, but with realization. By this point, South Vietnamese officers weren't just thinking about military objectives. They were thinking about civilians, about families, about what would happen if Saigon turned into another Hue, another city destroyed in the name of resistance. Long after the outcome was clear. And that raises a difficult question, one history doesn't like to ask out loud. What does fighting to the end mean when the end is already decided? For many commanders, standing down wasn't surrender, it was a calculation, a painful one. If the city fought, Saigon would burn. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands, would die. And for what? To delay the inevitable by days, by hours. The silence before the fall wasn't empty. It was heavy. It was filled with unspoken decisions made at checkpoints, in command posts, in living rooms where soldiers took off their uniforms for the last time. Meanwhile, politics had already sealed what weapons could no longer change. In Washington, the war was over in all but name. Congress had cut aid dramatically. Public support had collapsed. The message, though rarely stated outright, was clear: there would be no return. And wars cannot be fought on hope alone. This is the moment when the conflict stopped being about territory and started being about time. Time to evacuate, time to avoid bloodshed, time to manage an ending instead of chasing a victory that no longer existed. That's why Saigon didn't fight the way history expected it to. Not because the city had no defenders, but because its defenders understood the cost of a battle that could no longer change the result. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The war was no longer being lost on the battlefield. It was being lost in logistics, in politics, in decisions made far away from the front lines. By the time North Vietnamese forces approached the outskirts of Saigon, the outcome had already been written, not by tanks or troops, but by supply chains that had dried up and alliances that had quietly dissolved. The silence before the fall wasn't weakness. It was the sound of a war ending before the world was ready to admit it. And once you understand that silence, April 30th no longer looks like a sudden collapse. It looks like the final moment of a story whose ending had been decided long before the city ever stopped fighting. To understand why Saigon fell the way it did, you have to look far beyond the city itself. Because the real collapse didn't begin on April 30th. It began months earlier, thousands of miles away, in quiet rooms where no shots were fired and no cameras were rolling. By late 1974 and early 1975, one reality had become impossible to ignore. The war had already lost its political foundation. In Washington, the mood had changed completely. After years of protests, casualties, and broken trust, American public support was gone. Not fading, gone. The war was no longer something voters were willing to tolerate, let alone finance. And then came the decision that sealed everything. The United States Congress cut military aid to South Vietnam by more than 50%. On paper, it looked like a budget adjustment. In reality, it was a strategic earthquake. That aid wasn't abstract. It paid for ammunition, fuel, spare parts, aircraft maintenance, and logistics, the invisible systems that keep an army alive. When the money stopped flowing, the war didn't end overnight, but it began to suffocate. South Vietnam's leadership understood what this meant immediately. There would be no rescue, no sudden reversal, no dramatic return of American air power. The alliance that had defined the war for years had quietly ended. And from that moment on, every decision became about damage control. Nowhere was this more visible than in the Central Highlands. Entire provinces, strategically important, fiercely contested for years, were suddenly abandoned with little or no major combat. Not because they couldn't be defended in theory, but because defending them would drain resources needed elsewhere. And once one province fell, panic followed. Refugees flooded the roads. Units became entangled in civilian evacuations. Command structures broke down under pressure. Each retreat triggered the next. This wasn't a battlefield collapse, it was a chain reaction. Think of it like removing support beams from a building one by one. The structure doesn't fall immediately. It creaks, it sags, and then, suddenly, everything gives way, not because of a single blow, but because the foundation is gone. By early April 1975, Saigon found itself in a position no capital city wants to face. It wasn't defending a country anymore. It was managing an ending. That distinction matters. Because defending a country means fighting for territory, for leverage, for a future that can still be shaped. Managing an ending means minimizing casualties, preserving lives, and preventing chaos when defeat can no longer be avoided. South Vietnamese leaders were no longer asking, "How do we win?" They were asking, "How do we survive what comes next?" And this is where the popular story often gets it wrong. The fall of Saigon wasn't the result of a single military failure or a sudden loss of nerve. It was the final stage of a process that had already unfolded in slow motion. Once American support disappeared, time became the enemy. Every day without supplies weakened defenses. Every retreat sent a signal, both to soldiers and civilians, that the end was approaching. Every unanswered request for aid confirmed what leaders already knew. By April, Saigon was isolated, not just geographically, but politically. The decisions that mattered most were no longer being made in Vietnam. They had already been made elsewhere. And that's the hidden collapse most people never see. Not tanks at the gates, but budgets cut. Not explosions, but silence. Not defeat in battle, but abandonment in policy. By the time North Vietnamese forces advanced towards Saigon, the outcome was no longer in doubt. What remained was only the question of how the war would end, and how much suffering would come with it. So when we look back at those final days, it's important to remember this. Saigon didn't lose a war in April 1975. It inherited the consequences of decisions made months earlier. And once those decisions were set in motion, the fall of the city was no longer a matter of if, only when. April 30th, 1975 did not begin with a last stand. It began with waiting. As North Vietnamese tanks moved closer to Saigon, something unusual was happening inside the city. The government was no longer giving clear orders. Command lines were fractured, and many officers, men who had spent years fighting, were being told something unthinkable just months earlier. Avoid bloodshed. By the time the tanks entered the city, the South Vietnamese president had already resigned. Power had changed hands not through force, but through paperwork and emergency meetings. The chain of command, so essential in war, had become blurred, uncertain, and in some cases completely silent. Soldiers on the ground felt it immediately. No rallying speeches, no calls for reinforcements, no final instructions to defend the capital at all costs. Instead, many units were told to stay put, to stand down, to let events unfold. And this is where the story takes a turn most people don't expect. Because what happened that morning was not a battle, it was a transfer. Think about how rare that is in modern warfare. Capitals don't usually change hands quietly. They fall in flames, under artillery fire, amid screams and destruction. History has trained us to expect that ending. But Saigon defied that pattern. As tanks rolled through the gates of the presidential palace, there was no massive firefight to stop them, no coordinated resistance, no dramatic final defense. The war that had raged for decades arrived at its ending with an eerie calm. At 10:45 a.m., the surrender announcement was broadcast. No explosion marked the moment. No collapse of buildings. No final charge. Just words. For many listening, those words didn't even feel real. After years of uncertainty, loss, and sacrifice, the war ended not with a bang, but with a voice over the radio. And that silence that followed, it may be the most important sound of all, because silence tells us something that violence often hides. It tells us that the decision had already been made. By that morning, the outcome was no longer being contested. Commanders knew the cost of resistance would be paid not in strategy, but in civilian lives. Saigon was crowded, dense, and full of people who had already suffered enough. Turning the city into a battlefield would not change the political reality. It would only change the number of graves. So orders, where they existed at all, were shaped by restraint. Avoid bloodshed. Protect civilians. End this without turning the city into ruins. For some soldiers, this was devastating. Imagine dedicating years of your life to a cause, only to be told that the final act will not be fought. That history will not remember your courage in battle, but your decision not to fight. For civilians, the silence was terrifying in a different way. Silence leaves space for rumors, for fear, for unanswered questions about what comes next. Would there be retribution, re-education, peace? No one knew yet. And for Americans watching from afar, the lack of a final battle made the ending feel unfinished, unsatisfying, almost confusing. How could a war this long end like this? But that's the point. Wars don't always end when the shooting stops. Sometimes the shooting stops because the war has already ended. By April 30th, Saigon was no longer the center of a military struggle. It was the final stage of a political reality that had settled in months earlier. The evacuation had already happened. The aid had already been cut. The decisions that mattered had already been made. The tanks didn't arrive to conquer a city still fighting. They arrived to formalize what everyone already knew. And that's why April 30th should not be remembered as a final battle. It should be remembered as a moment of transition. From war to aftermath. From conflict to consequence. The war didn't end with an explosion. It ended with silence. And in that silence lies the clearest truth of all. Saigon didn't fall because it was defeated that day. It fell because the war had already been decided. And April 30th was simply the moment the world finally heard the answer. Here's the truth that still makes people uncomfortable. April 30th, 1975 was not the moment South Vietnam fell. It was the moment the world finally noticed. For years, history has treated that day as a dramatic ending, the last chapter. The final collapse, the moment everything changed. But if you followed this story closely, you already know something deeper was happening. Because by the time the last helicopter lifted off, the war was no longer being fought. It had already been decided. The real ending didn't come with tanks entering the city or a surrender broadcast over the radio. It came quietly, earlier, when the foundations of the war began to disappear one by one. It happened when aid stopped. Not all at once, not with a single announcement, but gradually. Budgets were cut, supplies were delayed, ammunition ran low, aircraft were grounded for lack of parts. What once felt like an endless flow of support slowed to a trickle, and then to nothing. Wars can survive defeats. They cannot survive abandonment. It happened when allies disengaged. Not with speeches or formal declarations, but with silence, phone calls that went unanswered, Requests that stalled, promises that were never renewed. South Vietnamese leaders didn't need an official notice to understand what this meant. They could feel it. And most importantly, it happened when commanders, on both sides, realized the outcome was already decided. This is the moment most people never see. The moment when leaders stop asking how to win, and start asking how to end this without destroying everything left behind. That realization doesn't come with drama. It comes with resignation. Once that shift happens, the war continues only in appearance. The uniforms are still worn, the weapons are still carried, but the belief, the thing that keeps people fighting through impossible odds, is gone. And belief is the true fuel of war. By early 1975, that fuel was exhausted. So when Americans watched helicopters lifting off rooftops, it felt like the end because it looked like the end. But in reality, it was the final act of a story whose conclusion had already been written. The helicopters weren't escaping a battlefield. They were leaving an aftermath. That distinction matters, because it forces us to rethink what it means for a war to end. We like clear moments, clear dates, clean conclusions. They make history easier to digest. April 30th fits neatly into a textbook. One day, one image, one ending. But real history is messier. The Vietnam War didn't end when Saigon fell. Saigon fell because the war had already ended. Ended politically. Ended strategically. Ended psychologically. By the time the final evacuation began, there was nothing left to save, not because the soldiers failed, but because the system supporting them no longer existed. And that reframes everything. It reframes the silence in the streets. It reframes the lack of a final battle. It reframes the choices made by commanders who chose restraint over destruction. Those choices weren't signs of weakness. They were acknowledgments of reality. And maybe that's the hardest lesson of all. Wars don't always end with surrender ceremonies or decisive victories. Sometimes they end when one side realizes it is fighting alone, long after the crowds have stopped watching. April 30th, 1975 wasn't the moment South Vietnam lost its war. It was the moment the illusion finally collapsed. The world saw helicopters. But what it was really witnessing was the last visible sign of a war that had already run out of time. Support and belief. And that's the twist history rarely tells us. The war didn't end with the last helicopter lifting off. The last helicopter lifted off because the war was already over. The fall of Saigon is remembered as chaos. That's the image most of us carry. Helicopters lifting off rooftops, crowds pressing forward, a sense of panic frozen in black and white photographs. It feels loud, sudden, dramatic, like history crashing down in a single moment. But when you step back, when you look beyond the images and into the decisions that shape them, history tells a much colder story. Because wars don't always end in battle. Sometimes they end in withdrawal, in exhaustion, in quiet decisions made far from the front lines, decisions no camera ever captures. And that's what makes the fall of Saigon so unsettling. There was no final showdown worthy of a movie ending. No decisive clash to signal victory or defeat in clear terms. Instead, there was silence, confusion, and a city that changed hands not through a last stand, but through resignation. That challenges how we used to thinking about war. We like our history clean. Clear winners, clear losers. A final moment we can point to and say, that's when it ended. But Saigon doesn't give us that comfort. What it gives us instead is a lesson, one that still matters today. Because the real story isn't just about Vietnam in 1975. It's about how power fades, how alliances erode, and how endings often arrive long before anyone is willing to admit them. By the time Saigon fell, the war had already been unraveling for months, maybe years. Support had dried up, trust had collapsed, belief had been replaced by survival. The soldiers didn't suddenly stop fighting. They ran out of reasons to believe that fighting would change anything. And that distinction matters. It forces us to look at the human cost of decisions made slowly, quietly, and far away. It reminds us that wars are not just fought by those on the battlefield, but shaped by politicians, budgets, public opinion, and patience, or the lack of it. For Americans, the fall of Saigon marked the end of a painful chapter, one many wanted to close as quickly as possible. But for the people who lived there, it wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning filled with uncertainty, fear, and unanswered questions. And for history, it left us with a mystery more powerful than any explosion. Not how Saigon fell, but how long it had been falling before anyone admitted it. That question still echoes today. Because if wars can end quietly, without a final battle, If they can be decided long before the last shots are fired, then how many other moments in history, and in our own time, are we misunderstanding right now? How many conflicts are still being fought on the surface, even though their outcomes have already been shaped behind closed doors? The Fall of Saigon teaches us that silence can be louder than gunfire, that absence can be more revealing than action, and that sometimes, the most important turning points are the ones no one announces. History didn't end in Saigon on April 30th, 1975. What ended was an illusion, that wars always conclude in fire and fury, with clarity and closure. Instead, Saigon reminds us of something far more uncomfortable. That endings often come quietly. That collapse can be slow. And that by the time the world finally notices, the story has already been over for a very long time. And maybe that is why the Fall of Saigon still matters. Not because of how it ended, but because of what it reveals about how wars truly end, and how easily we miss the moment when everything has already changed.